So, we've been in this series, we're calling it Transit. Just as I mentioned earlier, we said, hey, what we think we're called to be here is something like a transit system. Something like that mass transit, and we've made fun of MARTA a little bit, but I'm not sure that MARTA counts as mass transit, maybe just like some transit. But if you think of a mass transit system that's bringing people in and out and all over a metro region, that's sort of what we are. And we're all a part of that. We're a living system. It's not like we're just a cog in the machine, so to speak. The Bible describes us as a body. Right, that each one of us are members of a body, and so we're a living system, and we're bringing the gospel to those that have never heard it, and we're bringing those that have never heard it into encounters with the gospel, just that back and forth and all around, and so that sort of frames where we've been this month. Transit is what's been going on, and so. I've been riding transit and dropping people off at transit a lot lately. We've had guests kind of in and out of town, and I went out of town. I've been out of town the last couple, I think 2 of the last 3 weekends or something. I don't even know where I've been at this point. And so the word picture is kind of fresh in my mind. I don't know if it is for you or not. We didn't really use transit this weekend. We dropped some friends off, but we went to Charleston, which is where most of my wife's family is from, and went to a cousin's wedding down there. And most of you hear Charleston, and you're like, oh, paradise, right? I mean, it's sort of like, oh, it's so beautiful. We stay inside the entire time. They really do. When it's family that's somewhere, you don't get the tourist experience very much. So Charleston's kind of like, yeah, it exists. So we went down there together and went to this wedding, and I can't put into words the sweltering sauna that was Charleston this past weekend. I mean, it was unbelievable. So Allie's cousin's wedding was on a dock right along the Cooper River, and so it was a really pretty setting. But we get there at 3:30 when the wedding's about to start, and we're waiting, and we're waiting, and we're waiting. And I had worn a jacket because I decided it's Charleston. I can be I can be casual, and so I'm not going to wear a tie, but I'll wear a jacket to kind of tie it together. So I got my suit and my dress shirt on, and I'm dying. Like, unfreaking believable. I used to, so I've played music, obviously, with Ryan and John before, and so I played guitar a lot, and I used to think, I'd get this huge, sweat patch right here, and I used to think, oh, that's my guitar patch. Yeah, it's just when I play guitar, it sits right there, and it gets hot, and I get sweaty, and it's just this gross kind of thing, but it was cool, because I'm a musician, and that's cool, man. Nope, it's just gross. Apparently, it just happens when I get really hot. This entire side of my shirt is just glued to me and soaked and disgusting. So we sat out there for probably a half hour beyond the time that the wedding was supposed to start, because I think somebody's grandmother was just biking to the wedding or something. So anyway, we had fun. It was fun to... I've got a little 15-month-old daughter, and she's super precocious and crazy, and so it's fun to have her around her grandparents, aunts and uncles that haven't really seen her in a long time. My parents are coming in this weekend, and so it's just a fun time to watch her interact with them. Because they adore her, and they don't get to see her all the time, and so some of you we're friends, and so you hear me talk about her all the time, and you're like, oh my gosh, here he goes again. He's going to talk about the baby. But you think I'm bad. Wait till the extended family comes around, right? I mean, they think everything she does is like, oh, amazing. So they're just eating it up. Every little thing she does. And she started doing this thing recently where she's really pretty smart. She's 15 months old. She talks a fair amount. She's like running all over the place all the time. We can't keep up with her. And so she was saying daddy like many moons ago and mommy and all that jazz. And she's been able to identify us from pretty early on. And she's in this weird phase where she just says daddy to everything. Mommy had a dentist appointment this morning, so I did a little hanging out at the house while I worked, and Mommy comes through the door, and she goes, Daddy! Like, no, that's not how, you know this. Like, what's going on? And finally we realized, she's doing it this whole weekend, like, Daddy, Daddy, Daddy. Everything's daddy. All of a sudden, we finally realized it's a joke. She thinks it's funny. We finally were like, oh my gosh, she's laughing a little bit every time she says it. So she'll point to just like the little safety drawing on the side of her car seat that's just a round ball with like arms, right? Daddy, ha! Daddy, ha! Daddy, ha! So everything's daddy, ha! So she's a kook. And that's sort of the craziness that we live in the midst of right now. Daddy's everything to her right now. That's just her world, And luckily, we don't have to take her to like a specialist or something. Like she thinks everything's daddy. I don't know what's going on. Like, fix her. Because we know it's a joke. We suffer from the same sort of issue, but we don't know it's a joke. I don't know if you would think of it that way. We suffer from not recognizing who walked through the door. Really, though, we're not joking around. My 15-month-old daughter has a better sense of humor than we do, at least in a spiritual sense. As TC's pointing out that awe, like, maybe you had an experience like him recently. Maybe it was even tonight when we were worshiping. If so, sweet, love it. Let's soak that up. But how often are you living with a palpable sense of awe at who God is and what the good news is, what the gospel is? How often does it grip your heart when you wake up in the morning and your task list pops up in your brain, right? How often does the awe push that away for just a second, right? How often does the awe become the context for the task list or whatever is going on in your day? You recognize who walked through the door for you. That's sort of the baseline where we started when we said we're going to talk about transit. We started out in week 1. I'll just run through kind of the 4 weeks that we've had here. So if you haven't been here, you get a little bit of a rundown of, okay, that's what they've been talking about. I got some context. If you have been here, just a little reminder of where we've been. Week 1, we said the gospel is everything. I mean, it really, really is. The Christian life is not entered by faith and grace, and then I got to work, right? It entered by the mercy of God, but now, like, I don't know, I'm not really in awe of God. I just got to obey the rules. I'm not really in awe of the mercy and love and grace of Him coming to purchase me, literally. That doesn't really do much for me, man. I need something practical. It's not practical? Are you in awe? The gospel is everything. It changes everything. That's where we started out in week 1. We went to 1 Corinthians 1:18 and said the gospel is the power of God to those who are being saved. So not just those who will be saved, to those who are in the process us, Christians. The gospel is the power of God bringing us into the kingdom and through our lives as well. It's everything, right? The message of the cross is folly to the world, but to us, it's everything. It's the power of God. It's the power of God. It is everything. It changes everything. And so it means something for us. It means we take it out. One of the things that we've talked about, we started out in week 1, we just said, hey, we're all ministers. We're all ministers of the gospel. Right? Guys that stand on stage or get paid by churches, our role is to be those who equip God's people for the ministry, right? So that's the kind of gifting that we need to have if we're in this role. But you're in ministry as much as I am. And the ministry is the ministry of reconciliation, bringing the gospel to a world that does not yet know nor love the Lord. So the gospel is everything. Week 1, 1 Corinthians 1:18. And then we said, what's it mean then to take it out? We looked a little bit at Romans 1:16, which sounds very similar to 1 Corinthians 1:18. It says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God, right? I'm not ashamed. I'm not ashamed to say, I just don't measure up. I could never earn it. I'm completely dependent on grace. I'm not ashamed of that. I'm not ashamed of what Christ has done for me and in me. I have to show that. And so our second week was simply, don't hide who you are. Don't hide who you are. That's the first step in beginning to share this good news, beginning to be a living system together, is that we simply don't hide, right? Any relationship you would have, there's some natural progression of disclosure, isn't there? And there's some natural progression of, what's your name? You know, and if I've known you for 5 years, hopefully I know more than that. If we're friends, you know, if we work together, maybe I begin to know what your kids' names are, or your boyfriend or girlfriend's name is, or what your life looks like on the weekends and where you hang out. And maybe then I begin to understand things like what you value. I mean, even if we don't have specific value conversations, we're going to sit down and talk about the values that I have, and you should have them too. Even if I don't specifically talk that way in a very linear fashion, you're still going to pick up on my values, aren't you? If you have any kind of meaningful conversation with me, I don't have to turn into Mr. Shove the gospel down your throat. You're just going to get to know my values because I'm not hiding who I am, and that's essentially the first little step of being this transit system. Don't hide who you are, right? If the gospel's everything to you, then it affects everything, then it's going to come out, as long as you don't make sure that it doesn't, right? Is your relationship with God, does the good news affect the way you make decisions? Does it affect the people you hang around? Does it affect your value system, et cetera? Of course. So you would share that naturally. So don't hide who you are. And then last week, David came in and shared, it sounds very similar, but it's a little different. Not only don't hide who you are, but be yourself. Right? So don't hide who God has made you. Don't hide what God has done, but also be yourself. Bring you to bear in your relationships, with your family, at work, etc. We looked at 1 Corinthians 1:17, just the verse right before last week, a little bit, and it says this, and this is Paul, who's like the stud of the apostles, wrote most of the New Testament, brilliant of brilliance, Hebrew of Hebrews, like the dude. Paul says, Christ didn't send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross be emptied of its power. Paul didn't have to be a superstar per se. He didn't have to be eloquent. He didn't have to be loud. He didn't have to be anything other than who God had made him to be and be faithful. And so that's what we looked at last week. Just really be you. Be you and be faithful. And this week what we're saying is cultivate and integrate. And so we'll be looking at Acts 2:42. As TC mentioned, it's a pretty familiar passage probably to many of us. And so here's what we're saying. Cultivate and integrate means this. Cultivate community with insiders, with outsiders. Cultivate community with believers and with non-believers alike, right? With those that are sold on it and those that are skeptics. Cultivate community with both and seek to integrate. Seek to see those two communities integrate somehow. We'll get to what that means exactly toward the end, okay? So I know that's probably the part of it that you're like, how's that ever going to happen, right? We'll get to that. Let's look at Acts 2:42 just for a second. This is really deals primarily with cultivating community with insiders. I don't know if you can read all this or not, but feel free to grab your iBibles, or if you are a fan of actual paper, you can do that as well if you want to follow along. So this passage deals primarily with cultivating community with insiders, but it touches on some key ideas for community with outsiders as well. So let's just read this for a sec. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and to the fellowship, to the breaking of bread and to the prayers. And awe came upon every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles, and all who believed were together and had all things in common. They were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number day by day those who were being saved. So community with insiders. We're going to spend most of our evening sort of just breaking down Acts 2:42 in particular. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and the prayers. Right? So those are three things, not four things, really. Okay? The apostles' teaching, the fellowship, and the breaking of bread and the prayers. Right? So first, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. What's that mean? What's that mean? I can tell you what it does not mean. It does not mean they devoted themselves to theological minutia and knowing all these little details that are peripheral. They're not bad necessarily, but that's not what this is saying. Okay? It's not saying they devoted themselves to trying to understand Revelation. They devoted themselves to try to understand exactly what all the symbolism means and try to figure out when Jesus is coming back. It doesn't mean that. Revelation's part of the apostles' teaching, for sure, though it didn't exist at this time. But what this primarily means is they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching about Jesus. About Jesus. And in particular, if you think about this, they didn't have much other than the stories about Jesus' life and the Old Testament at that time. And so they devoted themselves to this in particular. Luke 24:27, after Jesus rises again, he comes to his apostles, his disciples, and he does something, beginning with Moses, so the writings of Moses, which would be the Pentateuch, the Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, etc. beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. So he walks back into the Old Testament scriptures with his disciples, and he explains it to them. He explains, hey, I know that for years you've thought of these rituals in the book of Leviticus, as just what you got to do, perhaps. Let me show you how these actually are pointing to my coming. Let me show you how the rock that Moses struck in the desert and water came from it. Let me show you how that was actually a representation of me. So Jesus goes back and explains the scriptures to them. Boing! Light bulb comes on, right? And then these apostles take that teaching to this fellowship of believers. So that is what they're devoted to. The gospel, the good news of how Jesus has come and fulfilled the law. How Jesus has come to purchase his people. How Jesus has come to unite himself to his people and bring his spirit to each one of us, to give us his power, his presence. The gospel. They devoted themselves to the gospel. Okay, second thing, they devoted themselves to the fellowship. Man, has this not become a cheap word? Maybe you don't think of it that way. Maybe you use it a fair amount. I don't know. It's such a cheap word, the way I hear it used these days. I can tell you, just like we said earlier, the gospel makes us a body. It doesn't make just me a body. It makes us a body, right? It makes us parts of the whole. It makes us brothers, sisters. We're adopted in Christ. We're his, and we're together. And that's different than the way we usually use the word fellowship, isn't it? They weren't devoted to the hangout. Hangouts are good, but that was not what they were talking about. Some of y'all go hang out at Taco Mac afterwards. Yes, amen, please do it. But they weren't ready to give their lives, and many of them gave their lives for this, by the way. They weren't giving their lives for the buffalo wings, right? I mean, they weren't giving their lives for watching SEC games together. I'm for it. It's great. But this is different, right? They were devoted to the brotherhood. They were devoted to partnership in the gospel. That's what this word fellowship really means, right? The Greek word is koinonia, and it really gets at that idea of a partnership together. It's not the community of the rings, is it? It's not the buddies of the rings. Go watch the trilogy of the buddies of the rings. It's the fellowship. They were partners together. Isn't it great that I can just use that, because even if you were a kid, you probably have seen it. You know what I'm talking about. These little imaginary creatures, as they're taking the ring to be destroyed, they're partners together, right? They were devoted to the brotherhood, arm in arm, ready to fight for one another. Devoted to the gospel, devoted to the brotherhood. Third thing, devoted to the breaking of bread and the prayers. Later in the passage, we read the whole thing. Later in the passage, it says they were breaking bread together in their homes. And so I'm led to believe that means this is a little different thing, that it's not just redundancy within just a couple verses, but that this is speaking to something different, especially since it's paired with the prayers, the breaking of bread and the prayers. They were devoted to worship together. They were devoted to public worship together. We know they were going to the temple together. They were breaking bread in their homes together, but they were also devoted to the breaking of bread, right? Coming together as God's people on the Sabbath to take of his grace, right? The breaking of that bread, I mean, there's nothing magical in the bread, is there? No. But we partake of his grace. We're partakers of the gospel. Or partakers of the divine nature. And so they were devoted to this. And let me say this. I'm not saying they were just devoted to some blind, dead ritual. By no means. They were casting their lives on Christ in this. They were really hanging their lives, all that they were, on this good news being true. You want to know how much you believe the gospel? How much do you pray? For me, it's pitifully less than I talk about it, right? And so prayer is coming to God and saying, I can't. Right? I mean, it's just talking to God, but at the end of the day, it's also just saying, God, you must, because I can't. Right? That's how much you believe the gospel. Communion is coming to God and saying, I need your grace. Because I mess it up again and again and again. I need your grace today. So they were devoted to the teaching of the gospel, something they already believed, but they were devoted to being reminded of it. They were devoted to hearing, like, how's that affect this part of my life, though, and that part of my life. And they were devoted to the brotherhood, the partnership that the gospel brings, and they were devoted to coming together and saying, we need you. We surrender. We ask for your grace, for your power, for your presence, etc. That's what these mean. And I'll say this, I love that the word here is devoted. Devotion as opposed to commitment. Commitment's a fine word, but it's become awfully cheap again in our society, hasn't it? It's different. It's different than just saying, yeah, that's good. That's good. It's a commitment, sure. Now, they were willing to hang their lives on this. They were willing to die for this stuff. They were devoted to it. Randy Pope, our lead teacher here at Perimeter, calls these three little points. He calls them right beliefs, right relationship, and right behaviors. And so he says, you put sort of those three things together in your life the way they were doing in Acts 2, and good things start to happen. And I would say it like this, and I've used this analogy with somebody even this week, so sorry if I'm repeating myself. But I love to go down to Jones Bridge Park, which is down on the Chattahoochee, just 5-10 minutes south of here. It's a gorgeous little spot. It's the rocks kind of jut out of the river there. You got some little rapids and stuff. Guys are out there fly fishing like a river runs through it, which makes me want to learn to fly fish. I'd probably be miserable, but something tells me you need to fly fish. So I love to go out there. It's actually where I proposed. And I just love to sit out there and think. And if I were to take a little rock from the side of the river and toss it in, and then 5 minutes later or so, pull it out, it would pretty much be the same rock, right? I mean, not too much can happen in 5 minutes in a river for a rock. But if I toss it in there for like 30 years, I won't recognize it anymore. Right? It's going to smooth that sucker out. It's going to be like the other stones in a riverbed. So smooth kind of pretty. It's gone from this craggy, nasty-looking thing to something beautiful. And that's a little bit of what happens when we're devoted to the gospel, the brotherhood, and worship together. We place ourselves in the river. You might look at yourself week to week and say, I don't really know what's happening, but you sit there year after year after year under good teaching. You sit there year after year after year with brothers and sisters, even when it's uncomfortable, and watch what God does. All right, so that tells us a little bit about cultivating community with insiders. The rest of the way, I'll be kind of short here, but community with outsiders. Cultivating community with outsiders, verse 47 says, they had favor with all people. Right? Gives us some detail sort of in between. We'll kind of come back and hit that, but 47 says, hey, they were devoted to these things. They put themselves in the river, and they had favor with all people. Now, that's not a guarantee, right? All you have to do is read a couple more chapters on, actually just even within chapter 2, read a little bit in Acts, and you will see that God's people do not always have favor with all the other people. As a matter of fact, sometimes it seems that that's rare. But it is God's gift to them in this time. God gives it. But they were also, they were in a place where there was the opportunity for God to do it. They were faithful to be in the temple. We at least see that in that passage. They were going into the temple, the place where everybody else in Jerusalem would have been at that time. They were in the marketplace, so to speak. So they were devoted to these things, and they weren't isolated all on their own. They weren't a holy huddle. They were out. And God gave them the gift of favor with the people. And in general, I mean, he promises to do that. It won't be all people necessarily like it says here in Acts, but in general, when we devote ourselves to these things and we intentionally step into the life of our company or our family or our friends or whatever, God promises to be faithful in that, to give us favor. And so we've kind of jumped from beginning, what were they devoted to? 47, what was the result? They had favor with all people, and we saw God's adding to their number day by day, people that are coming to know Jesus, coming to love Jesus and being saved by Jesus. But what about what happens in between? Right? What's sort of the process between that devotion and the result? 43 to 47, attractive community. That's what starts happening. Really attractive community. The community here was actually a draw. People saw this and were like, oh man, that seems pretty amazing. I'm going to just go check it out, because why not? I don't know much about this Jesus guy, but these people love each other. So I'm going to see what it's all about. As opposed to a hindrance. As opposed to a group of people that just seem like, God, I don't know if I can even break into that. I mean, they got more opinions than I have shirts. Like, I can't even begin to be a part of them. They might not be judgmental, but I'm scared of them. How often do our communities really look more like that? This was attractive community because of what they were devoted to. What happened? Awe. There was a sense of awe among them as they were devoted to these things. Wonders were happening. Now, this was a unique time in biblical history when miraculous things were kind of happening right and left. We do not expect that day to day to day. The Bible doesn't give us the indication that that is what you should expect to be normative in your life. But don't forget that the wonder, the biggest wonder of all, the greatest miracle of all, is God was adding to their number day by day those who were being saved. It's a much bigger deal when anybody comes to faith than a pillar of fire in the desert. I mean, that sounds pretty awesome to me, but that's nothing compared to what God does to bring one of us alive in Christ, right? When they started babbling right before this in like all these different languages all of a sudden, I shouldn't have used the word babbling actually, but when they started speaking in all these different languages and people from Persia and Greece and Rome and all over the place understood them, that's miraculous. It's amazing. Not even close. It's not even close to one coming into the kingdom. That's the miracle. Wonders happen when we're devoted to these things. Awe happens. Wonders happen. They were together. Right? They were with one another. They had all in common, selling and distributing. This is not a call to communism, but they cared for one another in such a way that, look, if you got a need, I'm going to find a way to help. I'm going to find a way to be a part of your life. I'm together. I'm with you. We have all in common. Not looking for reasons to divide, but looking for reasons to unite and be together. They were glad. They were generous. You're going to hang around people that are not thankful? You're going to hang around people that are not generally glad about life? No, not really. They were just attractive because Jesus made them attractive. Okay, so they were devoted to these things. God did stuff in them, awe, wonders, attractive community, and then results, God did stuff through them, okay? So what's it look like, though? We've talked about the cultivating a bit. What's it look like to integrate? Really, really simple. Really simple. Maybe two of you take that one guy you've been praying for out to dinner sometime. Integrate the communities that you have been cultivating, right? Maybe you intentionally accept a few more of the invitations to your non-believing friends' events, football watching parties or whatever. Sorry, football's on the brain right now. Whew, love it. And maybe, if you can, maybe take a friend or two along with you. Maybe take a friend or two along with you. I read this week about, so Lecrae hit #1. Did y'all know that? So he's this Christian rapper, and he's really, really good. And he hit #1 on the Billboard charts and on iTunes and on Amazon, and that's a really big deal from a business perspective. I don't know if you realize that or not, that Christian music hit #1 like overall. And he's curried so much favor in the hip-hop world. And I read an article about him this week where a secular rapper didn't like something he said. So he confronted him backstage in Austin after the South by Southwest conference, and he told him he didn't like what he had to say. And Lecrae sat there and just had a conversation with him. And so this guy said, he's just different, man. He's just different. I don't know what it is. He's different. I'm encouraged. I want to hear more from this guy. Maybe you've had people say that to you. I think you probably have, because being a Christian is a whole lot different than what people expect being a Christian to be. I know I've had plenty of people, especially when I worked in restaurants or was playing music out, playing gigs and stuff. People would say, "Man, you're different. You're not like all the other Christians." I'm like, no. The other Christians are different too. I think we should seek to expose our non-believing friends to us, not just me. We should show them that we are different because we are more attractive than you. So that's sort of the thought I want to leave you with. Seek to integrate the communities in more than just you by yourself. See if you can take a friend. See if you can bring a non-believing friend along with a couple Christian friends. Show them the we. My old buddy Matt Ballard always used to say, "A we created a you to be an us." God saved you. He loved you. He saved you from something. He saved you to something. He saved you to be a people. Christianity is not a solo act. He saved us to be a people. We reflect him. We bring him when we are devoted to these things, the gospel, the brotherhood, the worship together. It means we're devoted to him at the end of the day. We're leaning on him. So let's bring him to them. Which means let's bring us to them as well. Let me pray for us.